Now, joining me from Brighton in the United Kingdom is Dave Goulson. He's a professor of biology at the University of Sussex, and in Toulouse in France, we have Stuart Pimm, the Doris Duke Chair of Conservation Ecology at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. And Stuart is also president of the non-profit group Saving Species. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Let's first of all take this assessment from the United Nations that the way things are going, humankind itself is facing extinction. Is that over-dramatic? Is it alarmist, or is it realistic? Stuart?
It's too dramatic. It's not realistic. Are we going to go extinct? No. Are there many things that we can do in Britain, in the United States, in Turkey, around the world? Yes. But saying dramatic things that are going to be proven to be silly in a decade's time doesn't really help us very much.
Dave, a decade's time may be a very short time frame, but if we extend that time frame to longer, would that assessment from the United Nations be correct in your assessment?
I agree with Stuart in that I don't think we're going to drive ourselves extinct anytime soon, but I think we're making life much harder for future generations, that we're going to hand over the world in a rather sorry state, and it's very likely that much of the world's biodiversity will be gone, and that it will be harder for future generations of people to make a living without the services that wildlife provides to us and without a healthy environment.
Why is biodiversity that important to the planet? After all, hasn't it been the nature of the world as it is over 4 billion years old that no species really ever, as far as I understand, has lived forever? Everything eventually has gone extinct. Isn't that just the way of the world? Why is biodiversity right now so important? Both of you, but Dave first of all.
So there's no doubt at all that we are driving biodiversity, reducing the world's biodiversity. Species are going extinct at, we don't really know how fast, but we know it's much faster than the average historical rate. That we are essentially creating the sixth mass extinction event that Earth has seen. And it's true that species all go extinct eventually. Mankind will go extinct at some point, I'm sure. Whether that's sooner or later is hard to predict. But I would say that it's really foolish of us to wipe out other species on the planet for a number of reasons. Firstly, because they might be useful to us. We know that species provide lots of services, things like pollinating our crops, which it would be hard to do without. In many cases, we don't actually know whether a species does something useful or not. And therefore, we don't know what the consequences will be of driving species extinct, whether that will lead to some catastrophic collapse of ecosystems or just a general degradation of the planet is unclear. I would argue that whether or not species are vital to our survival, we have a moral duty to look after the other species on the planet. And that also some species probably don't do anything practically useful to us. Think, for example, of butterflies. Beautiful creatures, everyone loves butterflies, but actually the majority of them, perhaps all of them, don't do anything which is vital to human survival. But butterflies are disappearing. Do we want to leave future generations a world in which they can't enjoy the beauty of butterflies, unpretty birds, and many other of the Earth's wildlife? That seems to me a really sad inheritance to leave to future generations.
Stuart?
I agree. I agree with all of that. I think all the world's major religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, many others, all have a strong sense of ethical stewardship, that we have a responsibility to future generations, but there are strong ethical concerns throughout the world. And I think we must recognize that we are not treating our biological inheritance very, very well. I think the point about butterflies is well taken, that people enjoy nature. It's part of what gives us and our children, and now my grandchildren, pleasure, and I don't want to see that destroyed. But the other piece of this is really huge. and that is that the world's protected areas bring in a substantial amount of economic good. People want to visit national parks. Turkey has exceptional biodiversity, but it's not done as good a job as other countries in terms of protecting that. Is that our areas bring in tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars worth of income to the communities around them, and it just makes good economic sense to look after nature.
Don't we have to look at the lifestyle of human beings? And don't we reach the conclusion that what we're doing to the planet is simply the cost of our lifestyle? Ever since industrialization happened, the way we have been advancing in our lifestyles has damaged the rest of the planet. We're almost, humans, you could say, are almost like parasites, what we're doing to the planet. Is that fair enough, Stuart?
I think the challenge, I would phrase that slightly differently. Challenge is to find ways for local communities to lead sustainable lives, to get benefit from nature, and not to destroy it senselessly in a way that precludes, how they may use it in the future. It's a management issue. We need to be careful about that. But I think there are ways forward where people can benefit. I don't really buy the idea that we are, some awful parasite. I think we're very smart. I think we're very able to make sensible decisions. But we have to, we have to make them, and we have to sit down with different sectors in society.
Dave, what's the best way to make fellow man do something positive for the planet and preserve the biodiversity that we have at the moment?
That's a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer, but there's an interesting debate to be had about this. I recently heard David Attenborough say that he thinks conservationists are a bit too doom and gloom, and that turns, although he agrees that there are enormous environmental issues and that there is a biodiversity crisis, that if we are too negative, that people turn off, that they lose interest and they go off to watch the football or do something else. He has a point, but I do think that it's vitally important that we make it abundantly clear to people just how serious these environmental issues are. It isn't just the biodiversity crisis. That's part of a whole series of interrelated environmental problems that the growing human population is creating. To give you just another example, we're eroding and degrading the world's soils at a rate of perhaps 100 billion tonnes of topsoil a year are lost. And we can't quickly or easily replace those soils. It would take tens of thousands of years. So, and there are many others. Of course, climate change is perhaps the most obvious. So we're creating this kind of interrelated storm of issues and hoping that future generations of humans can sort out the mess we're going to leave them. And so it is serious. We may not be due to go extinct anytime soon, but we are making life really hard for future generations. And so we ought to do better than that. We owe them better than that. And we need to engage with people. We need to convince them of the seriousness of this issue. At the moment, I find it really frustrating. Maybe 5 or 10% of the world's population realise that we face an environmental catastrophe, if you like, of some scale in the near future. But most people are too busy earning a living, feeding their kids, worrying about their pension or whatever, and haven't really understood that unless we do things differently. One thing I find really puzzling is that most people would do almost anything for their kids, apart from apparently leave them a healthy planet to live on. And we must do better. How we persuade everyone to take this seriously, I don't know. Absolutely,
and most people would do anything for their dog or their cat. But, you say that it's incumbent upon us. You've both spoken about the moral imperative of leaving a better planet for future generations. You both are specialists in this field, and neither of you can answer, and fair enough, you can't answer how we can persuade people to change their habits that will lead to a better planet. And there are some people who say it's never going to happen because human beings are essentially selfish. Stuart says we're not necessarily parasites, but surely it seems that most people care about their very own immediate environment and are not worried about what's going to happen in millennia to come. And we're talking about a longer-term timescale here, aren't we? Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, my criticism of Sir David Attenborough is really separate from the two issues we've heard. I think the reality is that we have lots of solutions. We know that in many parts of the world, including Turkey, there is conflict between big animals, wolves and bears, and human livestock. Can we do something about that? Yes. There's a lot of things that individuals can do, what communities can do, what governments can do. And I think the problem with the wonderful movies that we get on television is that they don't talk enough about solutions. And that's really a shame, and it gives a very distorted message. I mean, many people talk about the world species going extinct 1,000 times faster than they should be. That's my work. I'm the purveyor of gloom and misery. How I get up in the morning is not to be depressed, but because of all the things that I know I can do with my partners around the world.
Dave, how frustrating is it for the scientific community when it has its findings that it shows politicians, who are the people that are elected to take action on our behalf? How frustrating is it when you then get inaction from governments? I'm going to give you one or two examples. The man who is foreign minister-elect, who will take over as part of the new Brazilian government in January, he believes that climate change is a Marxist plot that is designed to promote growth in China. In the UK, there's a new movement called Extinction Rebellion. They had a massive protest in London over the weekend. There were thousands of people there, and they say our politicians are not treating what's happening to the planet as a crisis, and that's why we're on the streets. How frustrating is it for you, who have the evidence through your research?
Enormously frustrating, of course. I think there are all sorts of reasons for it. The biggest of which is probably that most governments are very short-termist, that they're worrying about the next elections, which is usually a period of 4 or 5 years away, rather than thinking long-term and planning for decades ahead, which is, of course, what we should be doing. It's not helped by the fact that there are very few scientists in political positions. Most politicians don't have a science degree and perhaps are not well equipped to understand the problems and the magnitude of the problems that we face. I was struck by the fact that there was so little reporting of the event that you just mentioned, and generally of these environmental issues. I think I am sitting in a BBC studio, but the BBC doesn't often seem to cover environmental issues in the kind of depth and take them as seriously as they deserve, given how enormously important they are to us. So we somehow need to persuade governments to think beyond the economy and the next few years. The ultimate truth is that looking after the economy will be a waste of time if we destroy the environment, because ultimately economies will collapse if we don't have a healthy environment. But politicians don't seem to have yet quite grasped that vital point.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. We'll leave it there. Appreciate it. Joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt is the Executive Secretary of the UN Biodiversity Convention, Cristiana Pasca Palmer. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Palmer. How exactly are you framing your rallying call for the preservation of the planet's biodiversity?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Look, it is quite a rally indeed, and in many respects, it's a very grand challenge that we are embarking on here. But I am cautiously optimistic, I think, about the future. So we are here in Sharm el-Sheikh now, together with all the 196 countries that are part of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, a body that was established 25 years ago under the United Nations, to get all countries around the world to commit to important actions to safeguard life on Earth. There are some good news and some bad news. So on the not so good news side, perhaps, is that despite all the the efforts and the goodwill and many many programs, many initiatives, legislative action, global targets, a whole set of policies, both at the global level, but most importantly at national level, that have been implemented over these 25 years, we don't seem to be successful as a global community to really put a dent on the biodiversity loss and destruction of ecosystems. On the good news side, I think there is a bit of an awakening, and when I say that, I mean outside the usual circles of scientists and conservationists and environmental NGOs. We have seen in the last few years more interest from the business community, from political decision makers, to a certain extent from heads of state, which is quite new and which demonstrates, I think, a bit of a shift in the perception, but also an understanding that we are facing, as I think one of your previous speakers was referring to, a potential catastrophe. What we need to do, though, moving forward, is to see this movement growing rapidly. We need an acceleration of action, and we certainly need to do things differently, sometimes perhaps radically differently than we have done in the past. Now, the understanding may not be there yet with the general public or with some economic actors, and that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to pass this message, to ring the bell of urgent action, because our window of opportunity as the smartest species, one could argue, at the top of the food chain is rapidly closing.
Cristiana Pasca Palmer, we have to leave it there. Thank you for your time.